Throughout history, true influence meant the ability to change how millions of people lived their lives. Religious prophets whose words still guide billions, military leaders whose decisions shaped continents, revolutionary thinkers whose ideas transformed society, innovators who led us to the technology we now have. But today, that same word is used to describe people who film themselves doing viral dances, and others who manage to make fortunes from looking good and televising their drama to the world. That might sound like a massive downgrade, but here's the thing. We're not really looking at a sudden decline. We're just looking at the latest step of a pattern that's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. If you're expecting another breakdown on how social media is ruining society, this isn't it. This is about something much bigger. How the evolution of media and the ways we communicate have not only led to how divided we are today, but how that has transformed the concept of influence itself. Each evolution in how we communicate hasn't just changed who or what influences us. It's increasingly fractured us into smaller and smaller groups. The divisions we see today aren't random or sudden. They're simply the result of a series of steps we've taken in the West over centuries. Steps that have made these divisions inevitable. By the end of this video, you'll understand how ideas have always shaped society, how each new form of media have built upon the type of ideas that people identify themselves with, and why the divisions we see between us today are just the latest step in a long path that we've been taking over the last few centuries. But to really understand all of that, you have to realize the role that ideas have always played in the ways we've developed. Ideas have been humanity's most powerful forces. On the one hand, they're the things that bring us together, lead to innovations, and drive our progress. On the other hand, they're also the things that divide us, pit us against each other, and fuel our greatest conflicts. Today, we're constantly told that society is more polarized than it ever has been. Whether that's because of social media, political or religious extremists, ideological activists, or generational divides, everyone seems to have their own explanation for why this splintering is there. The thing that few people tend to realize is that they didn't just appear out of nowhere, and they're not accidental. They're just the latest expression of a pattern that has shaped society for centuries, getting more powerful, more personal, and more polarizing with each passing phase. To understand this, we need to look at how a few core types of ideas have been influencing Western society over the past 500 years. You can look back much further, but a good place to start is with religion. Pretty much every organized religion, at their core, provides a moral framework and guide for humanity with a vision for the betterment of society that gives people both an individual and a collective way to find identity and purpose. But while each religion at its core preaches peace and unity, the way people were led to interpret them and the institutions that represented them often brought about division and conflict. The Crusades, colonial expansion in the name of spreading faith, and the 30 Years' War show all the different ways of how an idea meant to unite humanity could also pit people against each other. As time passed, religion never disappeared, but a new dominant idea began to take shape: nationalism. The concept of national identity, what it meant to be English, French, or German, became an influential idea that reshaped the world. Where people say it started, whether it was the Puritan Revolution in England or the French Revolution, or even where it peaked, be it the 1848 European revolutions or the lead up to the First World War, ultimately doesn't matter. The ideas of nationalism ended up shaping the way that people identified themselves, which influenced the course of history. After nationalism came ideology, systems of ideas about how post-industrial societies should be organized. Unlike nationalism, which was about where you were born, ideologies were all about what you believed in. Capitalism, communism, fascism, and all their offshoots each offered a different vision of how society should work and influenced their followers to fight for the cause. It was these competing worldviews that drove conflicts from the Russian Civil War through to the Second World War and the Cold War, ultimately defining most of the 20th century. People today still use the ideas of ideology as a way to identify themselves and express who they are. But as the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, the next idea started to become more prevalent: technological and material progress. As with other ideas, This wasn't a new concept. None of these have a concrete start and end date, just periods where they tended to be dominant. The worship of advancement, innovation, and economic growth by any means necessary had been happening for most of the past 200 years up to that point. But the end of the ideological conflict saw this become the dominant idea, almost a pseudo-religion of sorts that characterized Western society in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Over the last decade or so, we've moved into yet another phase of the journey: idol worship. Through our screens, we form parasocial relationships with people who represent different combinations of all these previous ideas and many others. But unlike other phases that at least brought people together in differently sized groups, this new phase creates a different reality for each person. The key difference between this concept and those that came before it is that the influence that affects us is increasingly personalized, splitting society apart more than any previous system of ideas ever could. But that's just the latest step of a long sequence. Just think about the progression. Many religions aim to unite all of humanity under universal truths. Nationalism looked to unify people within national boundaries. Ideology looked to group people through shared beliefs. Tech worship celebrated individual achievement and the companies that would win. Today's version of idol worship creates a situation where it's individuals who are put on a pedestal by people through their own custom experience. All the ideas that were once there are still around, each having built on top of the other. With each phase though, the layers a person has to identify with has become more complex and more individualized. We've now gotten to a point where many people's identity and outlooks can't just be grouped simply. People's view of the world and themselves is different and tailored. But here's what makes this pattern so crucial to understand. The way these ideas spread didn't just happen all of a sudden by accident. That was made possible, or even inevitable, by something else that was evolving alongside them: the technology we used to spread them. Every shift in the big ideas that drove mankind has been directly powered by an evolution in the way that these ideas were able to be distributed through the development of different forms of media. We can trace this evolution systematically through each of the ideas we explored. What most people miss is that each new form of media didn't just reach more people. They worked to fundamentally change the way that the people who consumed it saw and interacted with the world. We've been gathering and sharing messages in tight-knit group settings for as long as humanity has been around, and there have always been leaders within them that spread ideas. Religious leaders were the original broadcasters, and their interpretations of the messages of their respective holy books were spread within these settings. Gutenberg's printing press was originally created in the 15th century, and initially, these religious institutions were the ones who were able to use the technology to expand their reach to the mass printing of religious texts and calls to action that helped in spreading these ideas and drawing in more people than they ever had been. Eventually, it was this technology that would go on to give birth to something entirely new: mass-produced newspapers. That in itself completely revolutionized the way that ideas spread and how people's worldviews were shaped. By the 18th century, newspapers had transformed societies in ways that their creators could have never imagined. As literacy increased around Europe and the notion of monarchs not being appointed by God began to spread, the way society viewed itself started to change. People began to unite around common languages, and they were exposed to the same stories and experiences, and eventually they began to imagine themselves as being part of something larger: a nation. Newspapers directly led to the rise of nationalism, and it's no coincidence that it was around this time that European countries went all out on forming and expanding their empires, and colonizing the rest of the world on the pretense of a civilizing mission. The next big leap came with the invention of the radio in the late 18th century. These didn't even require people to know how to read. It brought voices directly into people's homes. The radio was a major tool alongside the printed press used to mobilize people for action for the cause of ideology. The communists used it to unite people fighting during the Russian Civil War. The Nazis later weaponized it for mass indoctrination. Throughout the West, It was used to paint these opposing ideologies to capitalism as inherently evil. The radio didn't just help spread the ideas of ideology, it actually made ideologically fueled mass movements possible in the first place. Throughout the Cold War, it continued to be used as a way to influence countries' populations through ideological messages that were being put across on both sides, and it was only further enhanced by the invention of the television. With that, for the first time in history, millions could simultaneously watch the same events, see the same faces, and share the same experiences. That added a whole other phase to the second half of the 20th century, where the spread of ideas through culture being shown in people's living rooms was a whole other aspect to the conflict. Television itself went on to give birth to modern consumer culture. Advertising started evolving from simple product announcements to the almost trillion-dollar beast it is today. As the ideological battle died down and television culture continued to evolve, it began to teach people to want to buy things they don't need with money they don't have to impress people they don't even like. All of that led to the cult of consumption and the ever-growing demand for technological and economic progress at all costs. But then, the biggest change we had was with the creation of the internet. Web 1 democratized information and made everything visible. But Web 2, with the creation of social media, did something way more profound. Social media transformed every individual into a potential broadcaster, and every user into a product for advertisers to pay for the attention of. The institutions that had monopolized the ability to influence people for centuries were now competing for attention with anyone who chose to produce content. More than anything, we were now being exposed to individuals and their ideas, as well as what they represented. Every new medium of media had created tension within society, but there was a crucial difference with social media. While previous media technologies united people into larger groups, be that religious congregation, national patriots, or ideological movements, social media platforms fragmented audiences into not only increasingly smaller niches, but also a combination of whatever individual groups a person found themselves in. For the first time, the algorithms driving these platforms don't aim to create a consensus, find a shared understanding, or even try to deliver the truth. They're designed to maximize engagement, which they achieve by serving each user exactly what they want to see in a way that only solidifies their version of reality. This isn't a flaw in the system. This is the system working exactly as it was designed. What we're seeing today isn't just a new technology. It's a fundamental transformation in how influence works. Social platforms have become our new institutions. But unlike the churches, the publishers, and the broadcast networks of the past, they don't push us towards any consistent set of shared beliefs. They push us towards reinforcing our own worldviews through a personalized combination of messages from different creators. This brings us to the most important evolution: how these platforms have become the primary way for ideas to spread and for people to influence others. Just like how churches once set moral standards, newspapers once controlled how information was framed, and broadcasters once influenced public opinion, platforms now direct what billions of people see, think, and believe. But the thing is, they've done a lot more than just replace the old institutions of influence that we had. They've completely changed the way that influence works by revolutionizing the distribution of media. We've moved from ideas and institutions that pushed shared beliefs to platforms that profit from personalizing every user's reality. Where churches have Sunday service, newspapers have daily editions, and TV has scheduled programs, with social media we have an endless stream of content. The doom scrolling, the constant notifications, the trending topics, they've turned scheduled engagement into constant connection. The big difference is, while old institutions tried to unite people under shared beliefs, even if they were opposing others, today's platforms are naturally built to do just the opposite. They're designed with the sole goal of keeping you on there for as long as possible, shaped by algorithms that know exactly what to feed you to keep you scrolling. The concept of an influencer may be relatively new, but it isn't that influential figures never existed. It's just that how you build and maintain influence today has completely changed. Just think about it. Priests, Spiritual leaders, or even someone like Jordan Peterson, can reach millions of people speaking about lessons from the holy books without having to step foot in a church. Political leaders that once needed the party machinery or media coverage can now jump on podcasts to talk to anyone, or post on Twitter to speak their minds. Even if the concept of an OnlyFans creator might be new, they're just the direct-to-consumer, more explicit version of the role that Playboy and many others once played. Someone like Mr. Beast, for example, isn't just a content creator. He's built a media empire with more daily reach than most national TV networks. What makes this big shift in influence revolutionary is that these influencers can reach millions of people while speaking to each one on an individual level. They're building audiences bigger and faster than traditional institutions ever could, and tapping more into human psychology than any other form of media has ever allowed anyone to. Institutions and wider ideas have been replaced by individuals who represent certain things to certain people. The way people engage with creators and content, influencing how they form their worldviews, has evolved in a way that is tailored not to a region, to a country, or a social class, but to what keeps an individual on a platform for the longest amount of time. We haven't just seen a shift in the way that information spreads and how it influences people. We've seen a shift to the very concept of influence itself. Today, people talk about the death of traditional media as if it's something new. Cable TV is dying. Newspapers are finished. No one goes to church anymore. But here's the thing. This pattern isn't new at all. Newspapers have been going through this for years. Radio sales have been on the decline since TV first came out. People lost faith in traditional media long before social media became the phenomenon it is today. And aside from attendances going back up at the end of horrifying world wars, churches in Europe have been having lower attendances since well before Nietzsche was writing about God being dead. Every time the system of media evolved, society splintered a little more. But this time, the splintering has reached an individual level. The echo chambers we were all a part of were once limited to our general regions of the world. Then it was your country. Then split into different groups within countries. Now, they've gone all the way down to the individual level, reinforcing everything you already believe. Society feels like it's more divided than it ever has been because it is, but the division itself isn't a new concept. The biggest difference between the division caused by this media revolution and the previous ones is that it hasn't led to an all-out war. So far, it's contained itself more to the digital world. It's easy to look back and reminisce on some golden age where everyone would get along and everything was just fine. But let's be real. The history of mankind is just a history of conflicts on a larger and larger scale. Don't romanticize the past and think there was some golden time that we veered away from. That time never existed. What we're seeing today isn't a crisis. It's the culmination of how media has been evolving to fragment society over centuries. Understanding this pattern doesn't solve our divisions, but it helps us see them for what they really are. The latest step in a long evolution of how ideas and media shape society. But here's the thing. Social media isn't good or evil. It's a tool, just like any other form of media that came before it or any one that will come after it. Some people use it to build incredible things, creating communities, sharing knowledge, building businesses, spreading positivity, and connecting with people they'd never have met without it. Many others get swallowed up by it, stuck in echo chambers where their views never get challenged and let their anger get weaponized for someone else's profit. Understanding these patterns help us see things for what they are and allow us to take a step back and not get overwhelmed by everything happening around us. As another example of that, I've made this video on why the world is at war today and the 4 big factors that led us to this point. As with all other forms of media, you can use it as a tool to get better, or you can get used by it for the benefit of advertisers and stakeholders. That choice is yours. It always has been.